Hello everybody and welcome to another video of the opening Simplified series. In this video I would like to talk about one historical match, the one in Reykjavik in 1972, and the last game of that match, the one that brought Fischer the World Championship title. Now, if you know a little bit about the match, you know how it went, you probably noticed that in the second half of the match Fischer was changing his openings against e4. And after suffering a bad defeat in the poison pawn variation in game 11, he dropped it altogether. And game 15, he played the Najdorf with bishop g5, bishop e7 line, which was also a close call. And after that, he never really repeated the Najdorf. In fact, he stopped playing the Sicilian, choosing the Aljechin defense and also the Pirc defense. Now, this changed for game 21, when he essayed the Sicilian again, but for the first time ever, he played another variation and not his beloved Najdorf. Now, in retrospect, when knowing how well it went for him, it's actually a surprise, and I always wonder why he didn't start playing this earlier, since it worked so well. So the Sicilian he played in this game 21. First, we need to know that in game 21, he was playing the black pieces and he was 1 point away from the championship. So he obviously didn't mind a draw with the black pieces, bringing him to half a point to the championship. And then with the next game with white, he would likely have made that draw. So generally, we can say that he was happy with the draw with the black pieces. Nevertheless, he still played the Sicilian. So which Sicilian did he play, in case you don't know? Well, he played the Kan Sicilian. So e4, c5, knight f3, e6. The first surprise, I would say, because first time that Fischer deviated from his usual d6 and the Najdorf. So e6, d4, cd4, knight e4, and now a6. Now, it's just a very interesting choice for that late in the match to introduce a completely different Sicilian that he had never played in his life. But obviously he was targeting Spassky's preferred favorite system against the Taimanov, which with the Kan move order, he had a pretty good and I would say relatively original idea in his mind, which worked perfectly in the game. We will get there. But before this video being somewhat like a repertoire video where I will suggest lines that I think, well, can never be 100% sure, I think that Fischer intended against White's other setups that did not occur in the game. So in this position, White has three main moves. Those are the move bishop d3, which in fact was Fischer's favorite. He in fact played it in game 7 against Petrosian in 1971, 1 year prior to the Spassky match. And he also played it in other games. There is the move c4, establishing the Maroczy bind. Nowadays, it's the favorite move of Magnus Carlsen, who has played it on more than one occasion, including his World Championship match against Anand in 2014. And there is the standard Sicilian move, knight c3. So we'll take a look at all three. Now, let's start with the move bishop d3, Fischer's favorite move, at least in the 70s. So nowadays, after bishop d3, what black players mostly do is to go bishop c5, attacking the knight, and when the knight drops back to b3, both bishop a7, keeping the bishop on the g1 a7 diagonal, and the move bishop e7 are possible and are very played quite a lot. But I have an impression that what Fischer had in mind here was something different. Now, always bearing in mind that he was not against a draw and choosing a calmer positions would suit him. I think he intended the move knight c6, which was in fact played against him by Petrosian in game 7 of their candidate's final match. So knight c6, attacking the knight on d4. So White takes on c6, and now we have I think Fischer would have deviated from what Petrosian did, which was Petrosian took with the b pawn, but after castles d5 c4 was quite strong, attacking black's center. Now these positions are likely tenable for black, but they are, I don't think, that comfortable on the other hand either. So what I think is that Fischer would have actually taken with the d pawn, establishing a symmetrical pawn structure, as you can see, 3 against 3 on the queen side and 4 against 4 on the king side. And this, in fact, has been known for a very long time. It was played, for example, in the Fischer's first candidates tournament in 1959 in the famous game Keres-Tal, the only one that Tal won against Keres in that event, losing the other 3, but one that turned critical for the final standings. And I think this would have been Fischer's choice because, like I said, draw was a good result, and this in fact leads to fairly safe positions for black with a symmetrical structure. And I think what is also important that the black's plan is really simple, pushing e5 and then just developing naturally. With this being said, it turns out that the position is a bit more dangerous for black than it appears, and some precision is definitely required. So I will show you just a few lines to give you an idea. What's important is that the brutal attempts to go at black's throat after short castle e5, f4 do not really work, because after e takes f4, bishop f4, knight e7 is an important move. Knight doesn't go to f6 so that it's attacked by e5, but rather it goes to e7, g6, hitting the bishop on f4 and establishing control over the e5 square. And dark square strategy is actually black's main idea in all these variations in this structure. So this is harmless. The engine suggests a move like bishop f4, controlling e5, stopping e5. And here again, the key move is the move knight e7, intending knight g6, fighting for the dark squares. Yeah. Now the point is that e5 is met by queen d4, attacking the bishop and attacking the pawn on b2. So that doesn't quite work. So the engine suggests dropping back to e3, and after e5 to continue with knight d2, claiming that, okay, the knight is not so great on e7, and once it goes to g6, it can be harassed later by h4, h5. Be that as it may, the position still remains quite playable for black. Let's say g3, intending h4, h5, bishop d6. Ideally, the bishop would go to c5, but here that's not possible because the bishop on e3 controls that square. h4, b5, grabbing some space on the queen side, h5, knight f8, and the knight gets rerouted to e6, which in fact is a very nice square controlling d4, c5. And later on, black would gladly exchange dark squared bishops, for example, with bishop c5. And this is, the engine gives some small advantage to white, but actually the position is quite playable. And I remember when studying this line in the late 90s, early noughties, the key game in this variation was the game Leko-Khalifman from their match in the year 2000, and where Leko played a really good opening and obtained a pleasant advantage. So we will follow that line, and this was considered the best way to play with white. So the move was knight d2. Developing the knight on c3 in this line is not very good because that knight on c3 is really has no prospects, because the c6 pawn is controlling both d5 and b5, and black will play e5, and the knight is really prospectless on c3. So knight d2, e5, and now knight c4. And this is the obviously a more active square for the knight. The pawn on e5 still doesn't hang because there is queen a5 check, and then the knight is hanging. And now, just to show you what Leko had in mind, Khalifman developed normally knight f6, castles. Now without the check on a5, the pawn on e5 is hanging. So queen c7, defending the pawn. Bishop d2, controlling the dark squares, intending later on b4, as we shall see. Bishop g4, developing with tempo because f3 would be met by check on c5. So queen e1, avoiding the weakening of the dark squares. b5, knight e3, now bishop c5, and now knight g4, queen e2 with the tempo, and knight drops back, and now b4. This is important. The bishop is on d2 being very useful, and after bishop b6, c4, and with the pair of bishops and a kind of an attack on the queen side, white obtained an advantage and won a very nice game. So this is what black should be avoiding, and it is possible to avoid it by being a bit more precise in the opening, starting with the move bishop e6. Yeah, and now again there is no knight e5 because of queen a5 check. Yeah, and the other moves For example, castle now leads to an endgame, take on c4, take on d1, and bishop c5. Once the bishop is developed on c5, black is usually doesn't have any problems. For example, let's say king f1, knight f6, f3, and king e7, and then the rook can come to d8. Black can grab some space on the queen side with b5. The bishop is active, and the bishop and knight are not inferior to the pair of bishops because the position is relatively closed, and white cannot really create any activity. So another move for here for white is queen h5, but doesn't quite work. Yeah, because there is bishop b4 and it's unpleasant. Check c3 cannot be played because the bishop on d3 is hanging, and bishop d2, knight d2, queen d4 is also quite comfortable for black. So the engine suggests something like queen f3, but now there is time for knight f6, knight d7, and this was the point of playing bishop e6 early on. So when the knight is on d7, the bishop is not blocked on e6, and this is possible because queen a5 is still the defense against the capture of the pawn on e5. So castle and now knight d7, defending the pawn comfortably, and the bishop is already developed. Let's say queen g3, yeah, f6, bishop e3, queen c7, again, very solid, very compact position for black, and playable middle game. And okay, final move to check, maybe bishop d2, bishop c5 now, trying to play along the lines of Khalifman, castles, bishop c4, knight f6, bishop d3, and b5. Yeah, and this is the difference with the Khalifman game, is that black is now better placed. Yeah, it's very similar position, but there are subtle differences. For example, b4 immediately now runs into bishop d4. Yeah, the queen is still on d8, not on c7, so c3 is met by bishop f2 check, and the bishop on d3 is hanging. And if rook b1, c5 already neutralizes any activity white may have on the queen side. There is a threat of c4. Yeah, bc5, bishop c5, and pawn on c2 and a2 are isolated, so black has a good position. And if queen e2, now queen e7 instead of queen c7, stopping b4, and black is fine. So this subtle move bishop e6 appears to solve black's problems here. So this is the, I would say again, intended perhaps intention, yeah, of Bobby Fischer against bishop d3. Again, it's just my guess, obviously. Now let's move on to c4, establishing the Maroczy bind. And here again, bearing in mind that equality is what he was searching, there is a very straightforward line here: knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4, pinning the knight and thus attacking the pawn on e4. And now there is basically a forcing line that I mentioned, starts with the move queen d3. Again, move like f3, for example, is met by castle when black can choose whether to go for d5 or maybe more hedgehog-like positions with d6. Move like bishop d3 is met by knight c6, attacking the knight on d4. And here there is also another forced line, which is good for black. Knight c6, dc6, again establishing the symmetrical pawn structure. Now if e5 is allowed, black will even be better because of this hole on d4, so e5 is forced. And now queen a5, attacking the pawn, but also the knight on c3. So take on f6, the bishop c3, bc3, queen c3. The rook is attacked, so this means that black will regain the piece. Bishop d2, queen d3, fg7, rook g8, bishop h6. And now black has a choice. He can take on c4, he can give a check on e4. There is a queen g6 probably should be avoided because there is queen d2, and then long castle it becomes a threat with threats along the d file. But queen c3 is actually very good, as after king f1, queen f6, or the immediate bishop d7 for that matter, prepares long castle, and black is not worse. Let's say queen f6, queen c1, e5, and the bishop can be developed. Yeah, long castle, and black obviously. Okay, bishop g5 should be taken into consideration, but again, after queen g7, there will be threat against g2. One way or another, like I say, black is not worse. Therefore, queen d3 is considered the main move, but again, now not knight c6 that was played again by Anand, for example, against Carlsen in the World Championship match in 2014, because the endgame after knight c6, dc, take on d8, king d8, e5, even though it's probably holdable for black, it's not a very pleasant one. And in fact, Anand, well, this was the famous double blunder game, and well, Anand eventually lost it. So black can play d6 and go for the hedgehog, but in fact d5 is the clearest equalizing move. Take on d5, take on d5, bishop e2, castles, castles, knight c6, and this is just massive simplification in the center. Knight c6, bc, cd5, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, and now the activity of the pieces compensates for these isolated pawns, either in the end game after queen d5, cd5, or in the middle game when the queen moves. Black's very active, and white cannot really organize any meaningful attack against these pawns. So this is just equal. So that's the move c4. Yeah. And the move Spassky played, knight c3, is met by knight c6. This is a very flexible and also very economic way of black playing the Sicilian. He only makes the necessary moves. So a6 was necessary to cover b5. Now the knights will be developed to f6 and c6. And then the pawn stays on d7, so d5 in one go can become an option. And also the bishop can be developed on the a3, f8 diagonal. So again, to show you the advantages of this move order. Now, first we can check the way Spassky played. He played bishop e3, knight f6, and now he played his preferred way of meeting the Timman of Sicilian, bishop e3, bishop d3, yeah, which now queen c7 would be a direct transposition to the Timman of, but this is where Fischer had the idea, d5 in one go, ed5, and now ed5. And it turns out that against this bishop e3, bishop d3 in the center, playing with this isolated pawn on d5 is not actually that bad, because the bishops get in the way actually of a possible attack against that pawn. Now Spassky castled short. After bishop d6, black was immediately equal, and as we know, eventually won the game. The NG suggests a more aggressive plan with queen d2, and after bishop d6, castles long, castles short, something like f3, let's say, controlling the e4 square, maybe planning g4, but this after rook e8, it's a very, complex middle game, and black is not without chances. Then bishop d7 can happen, bishop can come to e5 or c5, maybe rook c8, b5, b4 at some stage later on with mutual chances, I would say. So this immediately kind of solves the problem with this bishop e3, bishop d3 opening idea. But the other ideas, for example, can also be met by direct play, not necessarily transposing to the Timman or the Scheveningen. So for example, let's say queen d2, intending a King's Indian attack, let's say f3 along castle, but now e5 is very, very interesting. Yeah. And if knight c6, dc6, we already established our pawn structure that we are aiming for. And in case of knight f5, then d5, ed5, bishop f5, dc6, and now very strong move, queen c7, intending to take with the queen. And if cb7, queen b7, turns out that white cannot easily finish development, and black has excellent compensation. Long castles just runs into the attack with rook b8 and so forth. Bishop can come out, short castle, black will use both b and c open files for the attack. Bishop from f1 can't be easily developed because the g2 pawn is hanging. So this is actually good compensation for black here. So that's queen d2. Another attempt is f3, but then again d5. ed5, knight d5, knight d5, and now both ed5 and queen d5 both lead to equality. Either queen d5 or ed5. Black is again okay here. And another idea is queen f3, again with the idea of some long castle, but now again bishop b4, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn is not on d6. So threatening to take, yeah? And if knight c6, the engine wants to take with bc6 and go d5, which leads to more complex play, but there is nothing wrong with taking with d pawn, establishing our pawn structure. And if g4, for example, e5, g5, knight d7, again, it's pretty unclear. Yeah, black evacuated the king side. Yeah, then maybe b5, queen a5, maybe knight c5, knight e6, or knight f8, knight d6, with pretty complex middle game. So white can play short bishop e2, knight f6, and castles, and this is actually the only move order where black is more or less forced to transpose either to the Scheveningen with d6 or the Timman with queen c7, with again later possibility to play d6 and go for the Scheveningen. I would recommend d6 because with the queen on d8, there are lines where black can go without the development of the queen to c7. But the engine also suggests some strange lines like bishop d6, for example. You can explore if you want. Yeah. Worth pointing out that the d5 here doesn't work because after e5, bishop f3. Now we see the difference with the development of the bishop to e2 and d3. From e2 it can come to f3, targeting this pawn on d5. And if bishop e7, knight d2, and already the pawn is attacked 3 times. And if bishop e6, then knight f4. And it's becoming problematic for black. So this is the reason why d5 doesn't really work. Here the engine wants to just castle and sacrifice the pawn with some compensation, but I just don't buy that. So against bishop e2, knight f6, short castle, Fischer most likely would have transposed to a Scheveningen. But the main move here is considered the move knight c6. Now dc6 doesn't work, unfortunately, because after the exchange of queens, white manages to go e5 or go bishop f4 and then e5. And we saw that this endgame from the game Carlsen Anand is not so pleasant for black. So here we must take with the b pawn. But what it happens here is that this structure is actually very easy to play with black. Just go d5, knight f6, bishop e7, maybe bishop b7 later on. And it's a very solid central structure, and black basically cannot really make a mistake when developing. A slightly peculiar line is the line with queen d3, d5, queen g3. Yeah, it became popular some time ago. The idea is to try to make it more difficult for black to develop the bishop from f8. But here also there are some good ways to play. One is the, let's say, knight f6, just a normal move developing, yeah. Bishop e2 and now d4, attacking the knight that is defending the pawn on e4. So e5 is the only move. Now knight d7, knight e4, check on a5, more or less forcing line. c3, queen e5, knight e5, cd4. And now either knight g6 with idea knight h4, knight f5 to target this pawn on d4. Or knight can drop also back to d7 and go to b6, d5. The engine prefers knight g6, knight h4, and then knight f5, where in fact both sides have their isolated pawns. So d4 and c6. Yeah, slightly more favorable for white, but being an endgame should be fine for black. So that's one line. What is the most critical one and probably the best way for black to play here is the move d4, immediately hitting the knight. Knight goes back to b1, so that after knight d2 it has access to the c4 square. Now h5, intending to harass the queen with h4 by white, and knight f6. The idea now is that the g4 is at black's disposal. So e5, attacking the knight, and now it's important not to go to g4, because after bishop f4 the knight is a bit short of squares, may have to go back to h6. Not so great, but knight e4. And it turns out that the somewhat loose position of the knight actually is not easy to take advantage of. For example, queen f4 now, attacking the knight, allows mass simplification with bishop b4, check, knight d2, bishop d2, queen d2, and now just simply c5, developing the bishop with no problems whatsoever for black. More precise is actually queen f3, the point being that bishop b4 now is met by c3, so the queen is defending the pawn, so c3 is possible. But here queen d5 works. e5 is under attack, bishop d3, now bishop b4. And again, if bishop d2 exchanges on d2, bishop d3 stops the queen from controlling c3, so there is no c3. Now king f1 should be played, and now f5. Defending the knight, ef6, knight f6, bishop g6, king d7, with kind of a very messy position, both kings having lost the right to castle, but it's objectively very unclear. Black has very good centralization, good central presence. White has a somewhat better structure, but still lagging back in development. It's pretty messy, but objectively it's fine for black. So going back to the position after bc6, bishop d3 is the main move, but like I said, it's very automatic to play for black these positions. d5, short castle, knight f6, and now whichever way white basically goes. Let's say queen f3, bishop e7, e5, knight d7, queen g3, attacking the pawn on g7 and g6. In all these positions, both g6 and king f8 are possible. I usually I'm suggesting to g6, because anyway, after bishop h6, bishop f8, these bishops can be exchanged and the king can walk to g7. And similar is rook e1, bishop e7, e5, knight d7, queen g4, g6, or king f8. Let's say bishop h6. And now interesting, good maneuver to know queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2, rook b1, and queen b4, activating the queen. Yeah, and then bishop f8 can be played to exchange these bishops. a5, bishop a6, or simply bishop b7, preparing c5, d4. Knight c5 is also an idea, maybe to eliminate the bishop on d3. And black is extremely solid in the center, as you can see, on the king side, and can slowly improve the position on the queen side in the ways that I just mentioned. And this is pretty much about what I have in mind that could have been Fischer's ideas against the alternatives white has early on in the Kan variation. And in a way, well, this is some sort of a Kan repertoire based on these ideas, yeah, which I think, okay, more plausible, at least taking into consideration the match situation and the games from that time. And with this, I will wrap up this video. And well, I hope you enjoyed it. In case you did, make sure you smash that subscribe button and support my channel. You can also check my Chessable courses. You can see the link up there, and my weekly Substack, weekly newsletter. Every Saturday, I send a write-up on chess on various topics with a link to the video published that day. So in case you like my work, you can also consider becoming a paid subscriber to my Substack. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. And like I say, always see you again soon. Cheers.